Well, tonight we're going to talk about how God can use circumstances to speak to us. Remember, in this series, we're talking about how to hear God's voice. We talked the first few weeks about very important things like the Holy Spirit, prayer, the Bible. Those are the most important, and you can use signs and wise counsel and circumstances as ways of confirmation. But I want to encourage you and remind you, don't just use signs and circumstances and wise counsel without really wrestling with God in prayer and reading the Bible and letting the Spirit of God speak to you. But these are important. Here's the overall theme of our time. God is not silent. The primary obstacle to hearing him is not his unwillingness to speak, but our unwillingness to listen due to distractions or not liking what we hear. God speaks through his Spirit that lives within all who have surrendered to a life with Jesus as Lord. Now, this is an important part, again, just to say out loud. If you grew up going to church or you used to be involved at a church, being involved in a church is not what we're talking about. I've asked many people in the past, oh, tell me about your relationship with God. And they begin by saying, well, I started coming to church. Now, church is the gathering of those who follow Jesus. And, our church in particular welcomes people who are still exploring. So coming on a Sunday is a part of the journey towards God and certainly can help us in our relationship with God. But what we're talking about is actually having a relationship with God, where you've at one point in your life said, you know what? I need what Jesus did on the cross to count for me. I need forgiveness. I need him to rescue me, save me, lead me. And as we've talked the last few Sundays, to be Lord of our life means he has authority over our life. He is the center of our life, and we want him to guide and lead us. So once you say yes to Jesus, something remarkable happens. The Spirit of God comes to live within you. And now all of a sudden, you have thoughts that could be from God. Now remember, we discussed how to know, and my kind of framework for figuring it out is if a thought is selfless, if it is requiring courage and consistent with his character, it's probably God. If it's selfish, is easy, and doesn't match his character, then it's not him. It's either yourself or darkness, and you don't want to listen to the dark. So this is critical. If you want to begin a relationship with Jesus and aren't sure how, let's talk after. Just a couple weeks ago, we had two of us get baptized, right? Which is a beautiful symbol of what's already happened in their hearts. But that is a beautiful way to remember the moment when God is now leading you. So here are the ways to remove distractions and to listen. Seeking God through prayer, the Bible, Spirit of God, signs, sage counsel, circumstances, and next week we're going to talk about significance. What that means is you have gifts, spiritual gifts, you have a personality, you have desires, a calling in your life. And so we're gonna do some exercises that'll help you kind of figure that part of your future out. But tonight, looking at circumstances, this is super important. Here's the core of this topic. With humility, we should always look at our circumstances. Humility, that means putting God above ourselves, putting others before ourselves. Don't get too egotistical. By the way, humility is thinking of yourself less, not thinking less of yourself. So there's two different ways that arrogance shows up. Either thinking too highly of yourself, that's pride, or thinking too lowly of yourself. That's having a low self-esteem. But in both instances, you're thinking about yourself. So thinking about yourself less, not thinking less about yourself, is what humility is. And so you're asking God for guidance, and you're saying, well, God, am I missing anything? Are you showing me clearly that I should move forward because of it? Just makes sense. There's a common sense element. Kind of like we talked about last week with wisdom, which, by the way, make sure I get, if you're new, your email address. I'll send you the notes so you can look through this later if you'd like and go back in the past. We'll also have all these videos up at some point. But here's the thing about circumstances. Nothing should be beneath us. Sometimes God opens a door that requires kneeling to go through. So what that means is, here's the thing. You and I are very much products of America, right? Or wherever you grew up. But right now we're in America. And what the world says you should be doing, or what makes you successful, or is the right thing to do, isn't always the same in God's kingdom, right? The world says, you know, I need her because she completes me, right? That's an old reference. I need new movie references. That's from Jerry Maguire. So there is no person on this planet that will complete you. Now, marriage is a beautiful thing, but so is singleness. In fact, it's a calling. It's actually a gift, the Bible tells us. Jesus was single. He was pretty good. Paul was single, right? So there are things the culture tells us. You can't be happy unless you're married, or happiness is the most important thing. Sometimes following Jesus actually means he's going to invite you into things that will be hard. Sometimes he calls us into things that are hard so that we can bring peace or joy. But we don't want to miss out on what God has for us just because, well, it makes sense. It's a pay raise or it's easier, right? Those things could factor in, but they may not be what God's inviting you into. Too often we miss God's leading because we think we are above or beyond or too good for opportunities offered to us. When we were looking at whether or not to move, I shared some of that story. I'll share a little bit more of that later. But I was the executive pastor at a large internationally known church. I traveled the world. It was amazing, and I was a workaholic. And I wasn't there for my wife and kids more often than I should not have been. You know what I'm saying? And when I moved here, I was no longer the boss. I had 5 bosses, and it was not a lateral move. It was a move down. Didn't make any sense. There was a dramatic pay cut, but I was called by God to do it, right? I was moving back to Texas. I grew up in Texas. I didn't want to live in Texas. But sometimes God calls you to do things that are better for you. And by the way, it took me about 2 or 3 years to realize, oh my gosh, this wasn't a step down. This was everything that happened before was actually preparing me for this step. This was where I was supposed to be next and where I am, right? So don't let circumstances according to how the world would interpret them be your guide. Let circumstances help. And I'll share a couple examples that might make more sense. Here's the thing. Some of us lack courage to do something new, but some of us lack the character to stay where we are. Okay? So sometimes some of us, our personality might tempt us to always do something new and never commit. So more than likely, God's going to actually ask you to try to commit. Some of us are going to be, we're just for the status quo. We don't want to change at all. And we might be the ones that should be more open to listening to, I want you to try something new. Okay? Our circumstances do not mean we should choose what is easiest, but instead we should consider if God is opening an opportunity in such a way that we need to go through it or stay or not. All right. If you didn't get this book, I have a free copy of this book for you. This is what we'll discuss on the last week. You don't have to read through it to be ready. It's an easy read. I once had someone tell me, your book was so easy to read. I read it all on one flight. I said, thank you. I want to write something that you have to think about and not just read right through. But if you want to read it before we meet on March the 5th, we'll talk through that a little bit more. But again, it's free for everybody here. All right, so here are a couple of verses that talk about circumstances and how God can use them in our life. All right, this is one of my favorite verses as of late. Paul is standing in the Areopagus at what's called Mars Hill. And you can walk and see Mars Hill. You can stand on Mars Hill, where basically these philosophers had Paul on trial because he was talking of this new reality of a crucified Messiah who was alive. And they wanted to hear about this. These were the Stoics, if you've heard of people who are Stoic. The Stoics were there. The Epicureans were there. These are people that followed in Greek philosophy, right? Athens is in Greece. And so there he was, and he was proclaiming uh, he said, I can see that you are very religious, because they even had a plaque that said, a shrine to the unknown God, just to cover all their bases. They had lots of gods. And so he said, I'm here to describe to you the unknown God. And he then begins to explain who God is very differently than he did to the people in Berea, because all the people there already believed the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, or the Old Testament is what they had at the time. So he taught to them about Jesus differently. So he's giving us kind of a guide how to be a missionary, how to talk to people where they're at and explain things in a way they can understand. And one of the things he says is so remarkable. He says this: from one man, God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. In other words, you and I were born at the exact time in history and place on this planet that gives us the best opportunity to find God. And that's true of everyone around the world. Isn't that mind-blowing? The exact time in history and place on this planet that gives you the best opportunity to find the God who created you, loved you, and wants a relationship with you, right? So, and I've walked the streets of India, people who were born and raised never hearing the name of Jesus, having a vision of Jesus, unaware of who this vision was, only to find out when they went off to college of Jesus. And as he began to read the New Testament, it described the vision he saw when he was reading in Revelation, and that vision of Jesus that John in Revelation had. And he became a follower of Jesus, started a church that started 200 churches. That's the pastor whose church we've been helping build a hospital and supporting the orphans that live in the school that's on their property. Don't let anyone tell you that God is far from anyone. He is near all of us. And actually, sometimes being born in different places around the planet is exactly the right spot for them to actually still find Jesus. All right? Again, it's hard for us to wrap our mind around that, but we can trust God with everyone on the planet. In his heart, this is the next one, a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. Proverbs 16:9. Now, we talked a little bit about how to understand the Bible, and there's different types of literature. And so the Proverbs are a very unique sort of wisdom literature that tells you what's true and what you can count on in life, but there's always exceptions, right? In other words, this is something you can hold on to, but you don't want to necessarily start to default into, well, it doesn't matter what I just decide because God's already got it all figured out. That's not how this works. He's wanting to partner with us to guide us into what's best, and he can still rescue us if we go into the wrong direction. And even in Joel, a prophet named Joel said that God can even redeem the years that have been wasted, ruined by the locusts, right? So don't just default into, it doesn't matter what I do. Now, you can think like this: God, I trust you. I know that it doesn't matter what I do, you're going to guide me. It doesn't matter what this, if you get yourself overwhelmed with all the decisions and you're paralyzed, you still want to just start moving forward. I heard it said once, it's easier to guide a bucking bronco than to move a dead horse, right? And so it's almost like if there's this one crazy passage where Paul is she's trying to go into a particular place, right? And he's praying, and it says that the Father gave him a dream, but the Spirit wouldn't let him. The Spirit of Jesus wouldn't let him. It was like the whole Trinity was keeping him from going this way or that way. Then he has a dream of a man in Macedonia. So he says, we're going to Macedonia. He goes to Macedonia, and the first person that became a follower of Jesus was a woman named Lydia, right? And so he's just moving, and as he's moving, God is guiding him, right? So, but use this, allow this to remind you when you're overwhelmed. Okay, I may make some bad decisions that have some bad consequences, or I may make some good decisions that have some hard consequences. but he is with me no matter what, and he will guide me. All right, one of my favorite verses in the Bible: trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, surrender to him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. All right? One of our kind of next steps for the week is to read all of Proverbs 3. This is a great, great chapter that will guide us into how to move forward in life. Trust in the Lord. Lean not on your own understanding. In other words, too often we just go through life just making decisions and asking God to bless what we just did. How much better would it be if we started each day with, God, would you guide me in this meeting at work, in this conversation with my mom? Like whatever we have coming, like asking him to guide us and actually bringing things before him in prayer so that we might have thoughts or Bible verses that suddenly start to guide us. Then throughout the day, we begin to realize, oh, he's with me, he's guiding me, he's helping me. He is more concerned, or he desires more for us to do his will than we are. So the more we lean into our relationship with God, the more clear that becomes. And the more when we respond to his voice, we have this sense, you know what, maybe I should encourage that person. Maybe I should reach out to that person. All of a sudden, when we do that, his voice becomes clearer and clearer because we're keeping in step with the Spirit, as the Bible says. All right, I'm going to give you a couple stories. I shared with you how reading through the New Testament, or the words of Jesus, Proverbs and Psalms, my wife and I were praying whether or not we should move to Seattle. A friend of mine, crazy story. I shared some of it, but a little bit more of the detail. We went on a ski trip, me and my at the time, girlfriend. We weren't even engaged. And had a great time on the ski trip. About a year goes by. We go on the same ski trip with the same group. Then we go to visit the guy who led the ski trip, which is about 45 minutes to an hour away from where Deborah was living at the time. And we were just in the area, so we stopped at the church where he worked, and we said, "Hey, Norm, how's it going?" He said, "Great. It's so funny you're here today. We had never visited him there before." He said, "Today's my last day here." I said, "Really? What's going on?" He said, "I'm moving to Seattle to plant a church. In fact, why don't you come with me?" We're like, "Wait, what?" We're just saying hello. It was our senior year of college, so we started praying about it and thinking about it, and it started to make sense. Deborah had wanted to be a missionary to Mexico. I'd wanted to be a missionary to India. We weren't sure how that was going to work. There aren't very many Indians in Mexico or Mexicans in India. So Seattle made perfect sense, right? So then we're praying about this. He says, "We'll pay you. You'll be our youth pastor." Seattle's the most unchurched city in America. We started doing all this research, started really reading the Bible, as I mentioned, and it seemed like a great idea. Well, then he calls just after we were married and like 2 months before we were to move and said, "Hey, we'd still love for you to come, but we don't have any money for you." Oh, okay, shoot. So what do we do? Well, why don't you try to raise support and come? And if you don't raise enough, maybe you could find a job. Okay, wow, this changes everything, right? So I have 2 months to raise money, asked everybody I knew, many of whom did not want us to move to Seattle, thought it was a crazy idea to move from Dallas to Seattle. And we discovered later that we were able to raise a total of $30 for my grandmother because no one in the family wanted us to go, so they did not contribute. We did not know that yet, but we still felt like we were supposed to go, so we went. And interestingly enough, here's where the circumstances started to play out. There was a 96-year-old woman working at or teaching Sunday school at the church that I was youth pastor in Waco. Her niece, who was in her 70s, was a part of a church of 12 senior adults who had all got kicked out of other churches. And they were all huddled up in this one church called Brookhaven. And they did not have a pastor. And this guy, Norm, heard about this building, offered to be their pastor if he could plant a church in that building. So then when I'm trying to raise support and telling everybody about our move, I tell North Waco Baptist Church, we're moving to Seattle. we're planning a church in what's called Brookhaven Baptist Church. 96-year-old woman calls 72-year-old niece who lives in Seattle and says, hey, would you be open to our youth pastor and his wife moving into your mother-in-law apartment? That's the little apartment at the top, like it's an attic turned into an apartment. And she said, sure, I'll charge them $70 a month. That's very cheap, even in 1994. And so all of a sudden, no money, but a place to live. Okay, this feels like maybe we should do this, but we still have no job. We decide to do it anyway. We go up, we meet Ann here on the front porch. She introduces us to the guy that lives in this house as we're unloading our car after driving to Seattle. We'd never been there in our entire lives. That was our first time there. By the way, this was so long ago, there was no internet, all right? And so no FaceTiming mom and dad. It felt like we were moving overseas. It was so far away. It took us multiple days to get up there. And so I meet this guy. She says, this is Eric. He needs a job. And he says, oh, I just quit my job. Why don't you go down there and apply? They're desperate. I go and apply. They hire me immediately. I now have a job and a place to live. I became a delivery person. So I literally drove around town. And this is, some of you might remember Thomas guides. We didn't have GPS maps. So literally I'd drive around town looking through a Thomas guide, dropping off deliveries. So it was like deliveries before there was Uber Eats. Yes. So what's funny is the woman who was showing me how to do the route said, here's how to remember the streets downtown. This is what they taught us as kids. It's an acronym. Just take the first letter of every street downtown, and it spells out, Jesus made Seattle under protest. That's what they teach the children there. You know, it was James Street and Madison Street and Cherry Street. He did not make Seattle under protest, but that's what they were taught as kids. It was a very anti-Christian city. But we saw God do a lot of amazing things there. So all of a sudden, circumstances didn't seem to indicate we should do it, and we kept moving forward, and suddenly circumstances seemed to say, yes, we should do it. Well, it was a really hard place. 9 months after we got there, the senior pastor quit. And he had just burned himself out. Those senior adults were rough on him and expected more from him. And then the second guy that was there, that was his brother-in-law. So he left 9 months after that. So I was ready to leave. We had seen people come to faith, but some of those same people that we were trying to reach were also struggling with things that were just bigger than what I had ever dealt with before. And so I was ready to leave. I was ready to get out of there. And my wife had been studying. She'd gotten a Spanish degree, and now she was working on her she was wanting to go to occupational therapy school at the University of Washington. She didn't get in the first year. So circumstances, okay, she's not going to school here. We could go finish this in LA. I'd met somebody in LA, and it seemed like this is a great opportunity. And then all of a sudden, we're praying about what should we do. Remember what I said about sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay? She got into the University of Washington. And I was like, well, we don't have to stay. Like, we could also go to, you could try to USC or some other school. But here's what's crazy. Because she didn't get in the first year, when it would have been out-of-state tuition, now all of a sudden she would pay in-state tuition. So for the next 2 years, we stayed because it made the most sense. She worked so hard to get into the school. She was in the school. And by the way, during those 2 years is when God really worked on my character. It was my wilderness years, so to speak. I had a great deal of ego and so disappointment because things weren't as easy as I hoped. And I remember, I'm having to work other jobs instead of getting paid there. And we do these Saturday cleanup days. That was like my only day off. And I didn't want to clean on Saturdays, but I'd show up kind of with a bad attitude. And I remember after we went to a conference in Los Angeles, somebody showed me something called the character matrix. And it really challenged me to choose a path of faithfulness, humility, gratitude. And so I tried to live that out. And so I decided I was going to clean the toilets when no one was looking. Uh, I hated cleaning, and so now I was going to, choose to do the worst parts of cleaning. And do you know that by the time we left, there was so much God had done in my heart. It was so obvious. We had a new senior pastor we were able to hand the church off to, and it continued to go for another 10 years. Um, but sometimes God speaks through circumstances. Sometimes you have to submit your dreams for the person you've married, if you're married. Uh, I did not want to stay in Seattle, but we stayed in Seattle, and I'm so glad that we did. Let me give you another story. When we were in Los Angeles for 12 and a half years, some of this, again, I shared, but not all of it. The part I wanted to share this time was when I asked Erwin what I should do. Should we stay in Austin, or stay in Los Angeles, or go to Austin? He said, you should go to Austin, because I would never want your ministry to get in the way of your wife's happiness, because my wife was miserable. And I thought, I've never worried about that. Should I have been worried about that? And so the plan was I was going to plant a church in Austin, still be part of Mosaic, and I'd get paid for a year. And then after that, the church would have to grow to cover my salary. So that was the plan for a week. I told Deborah, let's do it. And a week later, she decided, you know what, let's just stay in LA. I was like, okay, like, wait a second, But it was almost like she needed to know I was willing to let go to be able to stay. But then 9 months later, that's the part I shared a couple weeks ago. God made it very clear that He was calling us here to Texas. And in that meeting, when I came up to Erwin and said, okay, Erwin, we are going to move. Because when I came back to him a year prior and said, hey, can we stay after all? He said, yes, you can stay, but I don't want to be on your prayer team anymore. Like basically, either stay here the rest of your life or one day come and tell me you're leaving. But telling me, I'm leaving, I'm not leaving. I want to leave. Should I leave? That was just too much for him. So I just showed up one day and said, hey, Erwin, it's time. We know we're supposed to go, but I want to finish well. What are the things I can help you with? And so he gave me 5 things. We came up with 5 things that together we had not yet accomplished. We needed a new constitution for the church. It's the same one they had since 1947. We needed new elders, same ones they had even before he had been the pastor. We needed to sell a property. We needed to do the next year's budget, which meant I needed to let go of 7 people. And so in that 1 month, I said, yes, I'm here to help. Let's do this. And all those things happened. All those things happened, every one of them. It was remarkable. And it was almost like, and it makes me sad, because for like 5 years we're working on those things and it never came together. And then in 1 month, it came together. But I think it was because I was finally, the way you guys know how this works, when you're walking with Jesus, there are moments where you take 2 steps forward, but then other moments you take 3 steps back. So it's not like for 5 years I was resistant to God. There's like in 5 years, in some areas there was victory, but in other areas there was just a lot of struggle. Resistance is the word I'm thinking of. And so what happened is I suddenly was no longer afraid of the people I'm supposed to be serving alongside, the elders, or the people that I was leading. So when I said, hey, I'm so sorry, I've got to let you go, and by the way, I'm letting myself go too, there was something about shifting where I feared God more than I feared people. And all of a sudden, everything just kind of came together quickly. And how often do we let the fear of man keep us from experiencing the closeness that God invites us to? By the way, fear of God, the holy fear of God, is not being afraid of him. It's being afraid of not being with him. It's a reverence, an awareness of how powerful and good and great he is. And by the way, fearing God gets rid of all the fear of people, of circumstances, of all the things. And so just again, a couple personal examples of how sometimes circumstances, if you look at them clearly, again, with wise counsel, with the Holy Spirit's guidance, reading the Bible, praying about it, they can be a real great confirmation. Sometimes we want something to not work out because we know it's going to be hard, but it's obviously clear that's what we should do, right? All right, so let's move to some next steps. Proverbs 3. Try and read it this week. I'll send this again in an email. Try and take this test, the spiritualgiftstest.com, and then kind of wrestle with these questions. Who is God calling me to be? Not necessarily talking about a career, right? In America, that's what we think is our identity. But think in terms of more like if you had a personal mission statement that you could live out no matter where you're getting paid, right? Some of you don't even realize it, but you're being paid by companies to be missionaries where you work. They're paying you to be a missionary. And so when you start to shift to think like that, who is God calling me to be? Like a personal mission statement. Then you can start to wrestle with, okay, where is he calling me to be? I'm not just talking cities. I'm talking where in town? Like, what is your mission field? And what is he calling me to do? That's when you finally wrestle with, okay, is this career going to be something where I can live out my faith, make a difference, be generous, maybe have people in my life that are encouragements? Is it match my personality and my gifts and talents? These are some great questions to kind of wrestle with, and let your circumstances kind of help guide you. Again, this is where kind of a combination of sage counsel and circumstances can help. All right, we're going to move into groups. Let me share with you what we're going to do tonight. You got several groups around the room. This group's kind of big if you want to do two groups, or if you want to cram together there, however you want to do it. We're going to talk through about 5 questions around the table. And then what I'd like to do is we'll come back in the last 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to do a little bit of a kind of a Lent service. If you've never been to like an Ash Wednesday, this is Thursday, and we're not going to put the ashes on your forehead. But I do want to invite you into an experience. Lent, what's beautiful about Lent, well, I'll talk about it more later. But I think you'll find it really meaningful. All right. And then after Lent, we can celebrate with some cupcakes again. All right. So start with these questions. When something becomes difficult, are you more likely to push through or assume it's a sign to stop? Again, kind of think about your personality. Why is it dangerous to assume that the easiest path is automatically God's will? Maybe you can give examples of when the harder path ended up being the exact right thing and you're glad you took it. Well, how can circumstances sometimes reveal character rather than direction? Reveal our character or even the character of God. All right? Ready,